Somewhere around 2021, a television network made a decision that would accidentally reshape British farming economics in ways no agriculture minister had planned for, no farming lobby had lobbied for, and no academic at Harper Adams University had ever modeled. They paid by the most credible available industry estimates, somewhere between 10 and 12 million pounds a year to film a man losing money on a farm in Oxfordshire. Nobody in Whitehall noticed, because this was never a television deal. It was the most expensive accidental farming subsidy in British history, and the people whose entire professional purpose was to support British agriculture were busy designing grant application forms that nobody could fill in correctly. That is where this story actually begins. Not with Jeremy Clarkson, the son of a Paddington Bear toy salesman from Doncaster, buying 1,000 acres of Cotswolds farmland in 2008 for £6 million and immediately discovering that owning a farm and understanding a farm are two entirely different propositions. Not with the £144 he made from it in year one, a figure so specific and so honest that it became, in its own way, the founding document of everything that followed. Not even with the moment Amazon came calling with a camera crew and a contract that nobody in the British farming industry fully understood the implications of. It begins with a question that has never been properly answered. Why did the most sophisticated streaming platform on Earth spend what serious industry observers believe to be north of £10 million annually, every single year, to watch crops fail, machinery break down in fields, and a man with no formal agricultural training make decisions that a qualified agronomist would describe as genuinely alarming? The answer, it turns out, is not what you think. And by the end of this, you will never look at a struggling British farm, a planning authority, or a celebrity beer brand the same way again. Cast your mind back not to 2021 but to a longer timeline, 19 years. That is how long Clarkson had owned Diddley Squat before most of Britain knew its name. He bought the land in 2008, 1,000 acres of Oxfordshire countryside, working farmland with a farmhouse, purchased for £6 million by a man who, by his own frank admission, knew almost nothing about what he was buying beyond the fact that he wanted it. For over a decade the farm operated as farms do, quietly, seasonally, at the mercy of weather systems that have no interest in television schedules or brand strategy. Clarkson hired Caleb Cooper, a young man who had grown up farming, who had learned everything he knew from his grandfather, who was already working the land at Diddley Squat before Clarkson arrived, and who had never appeared on television and had no particular ambition to do so, and between them they attempted to run a working arable operation in the Cotswolds. The results were, to use the technical agricultural term, mixed. In one honestly documented year, the farm generated a profit of £144 from 1,000 acres of English farmland. The number is not a rounding error. It is not a bad year obscuring better ones. It is a precise and rather clarifying statement about the economics of small-scale British arable farming in the second decade of the 21st century. Amazon looked at that figure and saw not a failure. They saw a format. And here is what nobody in British agriculture had fully understood at that point, the hinge on which this entire story turns. Agricultural failure when filmed with complete honesty, with a narrator who genuinely does not know what he is doing, alongside a co-presenter who genuinely does and cannot quite believe what he is watching, is not a liability to a streaming platform. It is the product. The farm was never the business. The farm was the film set. And Amazon, without entirely intending to, had become the most generous rural development fund in British history, one that required no application form, no sustainability assessment, no 5-year land management plan written in the specific bureaucratic language that causes otherwise competent farmers to abandon the process entirely before page 3. They just needed Jeremy Clarkson to keep making decisions that Caleb Cooper found professionally distressing, which it turned out was not difficult to arrange. Now here is the part that even most people who have followed this story closely, the farming press, the television critics, the business journalists who covered the Hawkstone numbers, have never fully joined up. The Amazon deal did not simply fund a television series. It created a financial architecture around Diddley Squat that made every other element of the operation viable in ways that none of them, individually, would have been without it. The farm shop, the brewery, the pub, the land valuation itself. Every single layer of this business exists in its current form because a streaming platform decided that British farming failure was compelling content for a global audience. Pull that thread and the whole thing looks entirely different. Consider the farm shop. When it opened, it had assets of £44,000, which is to say, a converted barn, some handmade signs, local produce arranged with the kind of care that suggested someone had thought about it seriously, and an operating permission that West Oxfordshire District Council had not made easy to obtain. £44,000. In context, that is a modest family car and a reasonable kitchen renovation. It is not the opening balance sheet of a business that would go on to attract 250,000 visitors a year and generate an estimated £2 million in annual revenue. But within the first full year of the television series airing on Amazon Prime, those same farm shop assets were valued at £1.34 million. Not because the produce had changed, not because the location had improved, not because some brilliant retail consultant had redesigned the shelving, because 250,000 people a year had begun making the journey to a farm in Chipping Norton that they had watched on a streaming platform, on their sofas in their living rooms, and had decided they wanted to see it in person. The streaming platform was, in effect, paying for the footfall. They simply called it a production budget. And then West Oxfordshire District Council arrived. The council, doing precisely what planning authorities are constitutionally designed to do, began raising objections with considerable thoroughness. They questioned the farm shop's operating conditions. They restricted its sourcing radius to 16 miles, a decision framed as a planning control and functioning, in practice, as a procurement policy for an operation the council did not fully understand it was helping to build. They challenged the car park. They wrote letters. They held hearings. They issued decisions with the full institutional confidence of an organization that believed, quite reasonably given the evidence available to it, that it was the most powerful entity in this particular story. It was not. Because here is the structural reality of a television series that documents every obstacle in real time and distributes that documentation to a global streaming audience. Every planning objection became a scene. Every restriction became a storyline. Every letter from West Oxfordshire District Council was, in functional terms, a script note that Amazon did not have to commission, pay for, or brief a writer to produce. The council thought they had leverage. They were providing the narrative. And the more consistently they objected, the more globally famous Diddley Squat became. Not in a minor local newspaper way. In a way that resulted in people flying to the United Kingdom from continental Europe, from North America, from Australia, to visit a farm shop in Oxfordshire that they had discovered not through any marketing campaign, not through any travel feature, not through any influencer partnership, but through a streaming documentary that the council had scene by scene helped to write. The 16-mile sourcing restriction deserves particular attention. Here, because it is the most elegant example of a constraint becoming a competitive advantage in recent British retail history. West Oxfordshire imposed that restriction as a limitation, a ceiling on what the shop could stock and where it could come from. Clarkson's partner, Lisa Hogan, a woman who had, quietly and without much public acknowledgement, become the most sophisticated brand architect in British rural business, later, admitted that it was the best thing that had ever happened to them. It forced them to find local suppliers they would never have searched for otherwise. Producers working within 16 miles of Chipping Norton, who made things of genuine quality and had no meaningful route to market. The restriction did not shrink the shop's offer. It concentrated it. And the concentrated, hyperlocal, visibly sourced offer, when filmed and distributed to 170 countries by a global streaming platform, became not a limitation but a provenance story of a kind that mainstream British food retail, with all its logistics infrastructure and supplier relationships, cannot replicate. Tesco has £65 billion in annual revenue. It cannot do what a 16-mile sourcing restriction and an Amazon documentary did for a farm shop in Oxfordshire. Lisa Hogan understood that before almost anyone else in this story did. The planning condition was not a constraint. It was a quality mark. And none of it, none of the footfall, none of the provenance story, none of the brand value, would have carried any reach without Amazon sitting underneath the entire structure, filming it with professional crews, editing it with genuine craft, and distributing it to an audience that no British farming operation had ever previously had access to. Which brings us to Hawkstone. The brewing industry, when Hawkstone launched, was not particularly concerned. The celebrity alcohol brand space had become crowded enough that a new entry, however well-funded, was generally assumed to follow a predictable arc, launch noise, initial listings, gradual fade as the celebrity association lost novelty and the product competed on its actual merits against established brands with deeper distribution and lower unit economics. That is not what happened. Hawkstone reached £21.3 million in annual revenue in 2025. The previous year it had turned over £7.8 million. That is a growth rate of 134% in a single year, in a category where single-digit growth is considered strong performance. The brewery now employs 53 people. Its beer is stocked in 2,000 pubs across Britain. The operation is valued at £75 million. Carlsberg, not a boutique craft operator, but one of the largest brewing groups on earth, reportedly offered £50 million to acquire it. The offer was declined. Think about that trajectory for a moment. A beer brand that the industry did not take, seriously is now worth more than the offer a global brewing conglomerate put on the table. And Carlsberg, which has the distribution network, the production infrastructure, and the marketing budget to take almost any brand to national scale, found that what Hawkstone had could not be purchased because what Hawkstone had was not a brand. It was an audience. 250,000 people a year visiting a farm shop. Millions more watching a series in which the beer was not advertised but lived, brewed from barley grown on the farm, sold in a pub that Clarkson had purchased and renovated for just over £1 million, consumed in the context of a story that viewers had been following for years. That is not brand awareness. That is something considerably more valuable and considerably more difficult to replicate. The Farmer's Dog Pub, purchased and renovated for approximately £1 million, now employs 146 people and has 360 car park spaces, a figure that tells you something specific about the volume of traffic a business generates when a streaming platform has been directing audiences toward it for several years. Stand back now. Look at the full picture. Amazon pays, by the most credible available estimates, between £10 and £12 million annually for the series. That payment funds the farm's operational losses, and a farm of this type, managed this way, with this level of deliberate transparency about its economics, does generate operational losses. The losses are real. But they are also, in a financial architecture this unusual, almost entirely beside the point, because the 10 to 12 million pays for the content. The content drives 250,000 visitors. The visitors generate 2 million in farm shop revenue. The farm shop story builds the Hawkstone audience. The Hawkstone audience generates 21 million in brewery revenue on a £75 million valuation. The pub employs 146 people on the back of Footfall, the television series created, and the land that Clarkson bought for £6 million in 2008 sits at the center of an operation now valued at £45 million. Every element funds the next. Every failure generates content. Every piece of content drives visitors. Every visitor purchases something. And the something they purchase builds a brand that a global brewing conglomerate could not buy for £50 million. This is not a farm. This is a flywheel. Caleb Cooper, who was already working at Diddley Squat before Clarkson arrived, who learned to farm from his grandfather, who found himself on a television series, not because anyone cast him for it, but because he was simply and already there, became, in the process, the most valuable unscripted character in British agricultural television. Not because a producer designed him that way, not because a casting director identified him, because the camera found a person whose expertise, whose directness, whose complete inability to be anything other than exactly what he is, created the one ingredient that the entire structure absolutely required. Authenticity. You cannot manufacture that. You can only find it and then point a camera at it. There are genuine risks in this structure that deserve honest acknowledgement, because this is not a story with only one dimension. The Amazon contract will not run indefinitely. The streaming landscape in 2026 is more competitive than it was when Clarkson's Farm first aired, and the economics of premium unscripted commissions are shifting in ways that make long-term projections genuinely uncertain. If that annual payment between £10 and £12 million were to stop or reduce significantly, or attach conditions that altered the creative freedom the series has operated with, the financial architecture of the entire operation would require fundamental rethinking. The farm itself, by its own honest accounting, is not commercially viable as a standalone proposition. That has been true from the beginning. It remains true now. But here is what that honest risk assessment actually reveals about something much larger. British farming has always required subsidy to survive. The mathematics of small-scale British arable farming in the modern era make independent viability, for most operations, a theoretical aspiration rather than a practical reality. For decades, that subsidy arrived through the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, imperfect, administratively demanding, politically contested, but broadly functional as a mechanism for keeping British farms operating. After Brexit, the subsidy architecture began migrating toward the government's environmental land management scheme, with its own application complexity and its own political uncertainty. Diddley Squat found a third route that no one in agricultural policy had imagined, and no one in Whitehall has yet properly acknowledged: corporate entertainment spend, rooted through a streaming platform, arriving on a Cotswolds farm as a production budget, and functioning in every meaningful economic sense as the most creatively structured and most commercially productive agricultural support payment in British farming history, one that required no application, no compliance framework, no annual review against sustainability metrics, just a camera crew, a contract, and a man from Doncaster willing to be honest on camera about how difficult this is. The Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs did not design it. The National Farmers Union did not lobby for it. Amazon does not think of it in those terms at all. They think of it as content acquisition. They think of it as audience retention. They think of it as the kind of format that travels well across territories and demographics and generates the subscriber loyalty that justifies the infrastructure spend of running a global streaming platform. But strip away the television language and what you have is a subsidy mechanism for British farming that works, that produces measurable economic output, that employs hundreds of people, that builds exportable British food brands, that drives rural tourism, that puts Cotswolds honey in the consciousness of people in California and Copenhagen and Melbourne who had never previously thought about Oxfordshire agriculture. 250,000 people a year drive to a farm that, without Amazon, would be producing 144 pounds of annual profit, and buying beer that did not exist 5 years ago from a brewery that a global conglomerate tried to acquire for £50 million and was told no. That is not a television deal. That is an agricultural economy. Built not by policy, not by subsidy frameworks, not by rural development strategy documents produced in Whitehall after 18 months of consultation. Built by letting people watch. Jeremy Clarkson, who freely admits he still does not entirely understand farming, who makes decisions that cause his farm manager genuine professional distress, who turned 144 pounds of annual profit into the founding story of a £45 million operation, did one thing that the British farming industry, for all its expertise and all its history, had never quite managed to do at scale. He showed people what farming actually looks like. Not the version in the supermarket aisle, with its clean packaging and its seasonal imagery and its careful distance from the reality of how food arrives there. The actual version? The broken machinery and the failed harvests and the planning disputes and the honest accounting and the relationships and the arguments and the moments of genuine joy when something works. And it turned out that people in Britain and everywhere else had been waiting a very long time to see exactly that. That is not a media strategy. That is a human truth, and one streaming platform, writing a check that no agriculture minister ever thought to write, accidentally proved it. If you found this one as absorbing as we did, and we genuinely hope you have, do subscribe and tap the notification bell. There's a video on screen right now that we think you'll find equally rewarding, and drop us a comment below. We'd genuinely like to know, if you've made the trip to Diddley Squat, what did you buy? And was the queue, because there is always a queue, worth every minute of it? Thank you, as always, for watching.